I'm so done with this double standard of nationalism for me, but not for thee. And it's reared its head again because Leo Kearse embarked on a good faith dialogue with Melanie Phillips, the Jewish commentator who used to live in Britain, now lives in Israel, because she feared the level of anti-Semitism coming from the Muslim migrants that she spent so long criticising, but has now turned her ire towards the likes of Restore Britain and anyone arguing for parity between conceptions of identity and national sovereignty between Israel and Britain. Because there is a notable amount of cognitive dissonance on the British right who say, well, Israel needs to exist for the demographic security, the continued existence of Jewish people. It needs to be a homeland by and for Jewish people, and it works, it's successful, and we should support it, but Britain can't have that. We're a nation of values, citizenship is sacred, and anyone can just become British by self-identifying as if they were a man putting on a dress and calling themselves a woman. And Leo Kearse engaged in a good faith dialogue with this post, saying that he finds the spat between Restore and Zionists infuriating because he himself is a Zionist. He says he's an Anglo-Saxon white man. All right, you're a Scot, don't stretch it. Just a joke. Saying when he starts talking about Zionism, I should point out I'm a massive fan. I believe Jews have a right to a homeland, a right to self-determination and to control their borders. The thing is, I believe that the men and women of Britain have this right as well. And this seems to be where I diverge from the people criticising Restore. Now, allow me to lay out my position. I wouldn't call myself a Zionist, but like Yoram Hazony, who would call himself a Zionist, I recognise that nation-states are the best mode of social organisation for nations, for peoples. They lead to the most amount of peace, prosperity and security, and they seem to be the naturally scaling mode of organisation for ethnic groups, and ethnic groups are nations. The name is one and the same, back to the Hebrew Bible. And so, when Leo puts this forward, saying, I want what Israel has, that's my position. I think I've been pretty clear about that, and I feel the same way as any ethnic group would about my own people. I think it's suicidal to want to deprive yourself of something that works for your own people, but support it somewhere else. And he quotes Melanie Phillips saying, the far right noisily identify British identity with Christianity, but a Hindu or a Sikh or a Jew or a Muslim is as British as anyone else. And she said migrants, upon taking citizenship, all become equally British. But this clashes with her vision of Israel. Israel is a Jewish state, its national identity is Israeli and Jewish, so Arabs can only have one, the first, civic identity, but not the culturally fundamental second one. No, just as Israeli as anyone else there, Melanie Phillips accepts an ancestral peoplehood basis for Jewish national self-determination in Israel, while expressly denying that British national identity has an equivalent ethnic or ancestry-based character. And he points out that Alistair Heath in The Telegraph, and Alistair Heath himself is a Zionist in the same way, said that Charlie Downes's statement that just 54% of babies being born to white British mothers in 2024, it's now down to 52% in the first quarter of 2026, represents an existential threat to our nation, to our people, because it does. It represents the demographic erasure of native people in the British Isles. And Alistair Heath said, well, this is racism! But it's only racism if you recognise different groups exist and you call that racism. Racism applies a moral valence to race. But what Charlie Downes is expressing is an in-group preference, which is normal to all peoples in all times and all places except post-war white nations. Because the principle of national sovereignty seems to be the thing scapegoated for why the Nazis conducted the Holocaust. And that's just not true. It's actually the reason why other nations, including Britain, found themselves on a different side to the Nazis in that particular conflict. But in this great levelling rendition of history in the 20th century, the concept of an open society, which Alistair Heath says he supports, this abolition of national preference, a love of one's own history, people, culture, identity, even the prying apart of the close-knit bonds of Western nuclearised families. In this version of history, which says that all of those things are to blame for racism and colonialism and genocide and the persecution of Jews, well, we have to be denied that nation while it has to be supported for the oppressed and the marginalised. It's just a mirror image of like third world identity politics just on the right, and I'm just not going to play that game because it leads my children to become the same hated minority in that country as that version of history says, of course, the Jews were when they were expelled from the various countries of Europe and before they had Israel as a response to the Holocaust. And so what ends up happening is Leo goes on a very long post extolling some of the virtues that Israel has that he would like to see in his own country. And Melanie Phillips responds saying, "This is very muddled. British identity is civic and not ethnic. It is totally different from Jewish identity, which is ethnic, religious, and cultural. Judaism is the unique fusion of a people, faith, and a land. That's why the Jewish people as a people is entitled to live in its ancestral homeland. That is expressly saying, I get a thing and you don't. And that is also saying, I speak from a position of, I hate to use the word privilege, but I speak from a position as a Jewish person of having the right, the entitlement to claim collective ownership over Jewish identity and the territory that is associated with that identity. That is to say, as a Jewish person, Melanie Phillips gets to define what being a Jewish person is and why that entitles them to Israel. Whereas she also says, with a foot in both camps, as a British person, I get to say, well, Britain doesn't get that identity. But unlike Melanie Phillips, who, in her address to the World Jewish Congress, said, you need to be Jewish first and either British or American second, everything else is secondary, I don't have a backup country.
To fight, you need to know and love your identity. Israel gets it. Now, diaspora Jews need also to realize you are not just Americans with Judaism added on. In Britain, they're not just British Jews with Judaism added on. They are part of the British people, you are part of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, and that should come first. First and foremost, you are Jews. Everything else is secondary.
Well, sorry, Melanie, there is no secondary identity for me. There is no backup Britain for me. And so I think I actually get to define what being British means, thank you very much, given my ancestors have probably been here since the recession of the ice sheets. And that is a fair few thousand years longer than the claim that Jews make to Israel. And so if you recognise the claim that Jews make to Israel, then you must recognise the claim that the native British have to defining their own identity and determining the destiny of the British Isles. Otherwise, if you don't hold that principle in parity, you're just an ethnic partisan and I don't have to pay attention to you. I don't have to take you as a moral authority on what British identity actually means. She continues, Jewish identity is different again from Israeli identity. Arabs, Druze, and others are also Israeli citizens with equal civic and religious rights. But it is an uneasy tension. Let's be honest. Despite the progressive Jews that hold 20% of Israel being non-Jewish as a point of pride, Jewish nationalists aren't exactly delighted at the large population they have as a quirk of the region that turns an entire quarter of Jerusalem into an Arab slum and might board a bus in Tel Aviv with a bomb or a machine gun. They're not exactly happy about it, alright? I've spoken to some Jews that have joked about it, okay? But, she says, unless they convert to Judaism, they can't be Jews with their unique claim to self-determination in the land and their unique political rights to a state of their own. Right, but you still recognise the difference between ethnic and religious Judaism, just as we might recognise someone who is an adopted member of our tribe, a friend to the British people, an Anglophile, or who is married in, like Ruth the Moabite did to the Israelites. And, of course, you know, she was the grandmother of King David. So her descendants can still be within the line of the kings of Israel and end up with Jesus Christ himself, who I know that we have a bit of a disagreement about. But she's never Ruth the Israelite. She's still Ruth the Moabite. And so, someone can live in Britain who is not of British ancestry. We're not looking to have some sort of, like, 100% purity bloodline, you know, quota or anything here. Nobody that's engaging in the conversation seriously is, anyway. But what we are saying is we exist as a distinct people, and we have a claim to the land, and that claim is derived from the fact that we have inherited it from our ancestors, and we can trace our ancestors back beyond the Doomsday Book. So, again, we have the claim to our land, which is an island. You know, it's not like the borders have changed that much over time, except within Ireland and Scotland and Wales itself, but it's not like we've had an external outgroup annex our territory until, you know, the 1948 British Nationality Act and the recent small boat invasions and the Boris Wave. So it's not like we are confused about who the British people, the English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish are, and the fact that they are indigenous to this land. So it's actually much easier for us to define than it is in Israel. But if you're capable of defining it for Israel, then you should be able to define it for us. And any ambiguity about this is artificial, and it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And then she says, Because of the unique and multifaceted nature of Judaism, there's no crossover with British identity. Okay, well, you did say that you could be British Jews. You said that Judaism comes first and Britishness comes second, so maybe I'm misreading there, and maybe what you're saying is you can't compare Judaism and Israeli citizenship to being British. But okay, if there's no comparison, then why would I let you determine what being British is? Because you think that being Jewish matters first and foremost, and hey, that's fine, I expect that, you're clearly flourishing in Israel. I actually met Melanie out in Israel, and we had a discussion about this topic where we disagreed. I also invited her to sit down in front of a camera next time she's over in the UK as a result of my response to this post, and she read the post and didn't respond, so I thought, hey, I'd make this video. But if you're flourishing in Israel and you have the right to determine what being Jewish means, okay, then you kind of forfeit the right to explain my identity and why I don't get to have a country to me. And if you're expecting people to support Zionism, I mean, her latest book is making the case to Gentiles, essentially, why they should be in support of Israel, then if you have no theory of mind for why the Gentiles might want the same thing, why we might want some reciprocity here, then why should I support you having it for Israel either? Again, I do, I'm fine with it. But you're going to engender a lot less sympathy in me if you say, great, thanks for the support, you don't get to have that either. And I'm actually going to call you a racist if you try and have it. And then, as she says, I've written for decades, the British are not only entitled to, but should promote and defend their historic nation, identity, and culture. Okay, but you are precluding us from defining that in an exclusive way. So actually you don't support that. You support us defending it in a liberal fashion. And then she says, there's no conflict between those two positions. There is. And the suggestion that Jews want to deny the British the self-determination that Jews have fulfilled in the state of Israel is false and disgraceful. But you opened your post by saying, this is very muddled, British identity is civic and not ethnic. So you are saying that British identity is not the same as Jewish identity or the self-determination that Jews have fulfilled in the state of Israel. So you are denying it in the opening of your post and then saying that pointing out you're denying it is anti-Semitic. Sorry, but that's just bad faith. It is. And as I said in my response to her, which got quite a few more likes than her original post, she did open her post by denying the ethnic roots of British identity and said that Jewish identity was unique in its ties to ethnicity, religion, and territory. But is that true? I mean, the Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity by 686 AD, and actually the first king to convert to Christianity was King Ethelbert of Kent in 597 AD, the same year that the first Archbishop of Canterbury, which was Augustine of Canterbury, came over, and on the instruction of Pope Gregory I, banned cousin marriage, shaping the genetic continuity, the ancestry of those people in the British Isles. Alan McFarlane has a good passage on this. Quote, England's highly developed and individualistic market society was one which would lead to unusual affluence distributed widely over the population. It was a situation of very considerable social mobility, based on wealth rather than blood, and with few strong and permanent barriers between occupational groups, town and country, and social strata. The strong sense of individualism was likely to be found embedded in the laws, in the concept of individual rights, and independence and liberty of thought and religion. But also, it was found in the high trust, homogeneous demographics, the small family farm holdings, enabled by the abolition of the clan structure that you see still today in Asia, Africa, and the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East. It was because of the prohibition on cousin marriage, ratified later by the Catholic Church in especially most of Northwest Europe, that we developed those nuclearised family units, those manners, those morals, that ability to treat people as we meet them, that individualism which is unique. Individualism is England's tribalism, and so it doesn't apply to other demographics that are imported into our country that then just recreate the conditions of their home country in our country and are clearly not British in their behaviour and their ancestry. And this is a result of Christianity. As Tom Holland writes in Dominion, the Angles, let alone the Saxons and Jutes, didn't think of themselves as a single people. Their lands remained, in the wake of their baptism, after 686, what they had always been. A patchwork of rival kingdoms, governed by ambitious warlords. Yet the allure of the venerable Bede's vision would prove too bright to be snuffed out. In time, the Saxons and Jutes would indeed come to think of themselves as sharing a single identity with the Angles, and even to accept their name. Their kingdoms, following their union, would be known as Anglia, and in their own language, Engeland. Just as the inheritance of scripture had inspired a momentous new configuration of identities in the Near East, so also in Britain. The elements of Exodus, so evident in the stories that Muslims told of their origins, were shaping, at the far end of the world, the cocoon of myth in which another people were being formed, the English. England, as even Robert Toombs in the opening of The English and Their History acknowledges, is a land named after its people who were named by the standard bearers of the Christian faith, who shaped that people through their prohibition on cousin marriage and created their culture, their family units, the countryside stewarded by their farmers, the markets that led to the Industrial Revolution, that birthed the world-spanning empire that created one of the greatest civilizations that the world has ever seen. So, by Melanie Phillips' own qualifications, we are a people with a land, a distinct inheritance, a distinct set of ethnic groups, and a distinct religion. So that would qualify all of the criteria that she sets out as distinguishing Jews from Brits. Well, if we fit the same criteria, then we should have the same claim to our country. And depriving us of that begins to look spiteful. Remember when I said earlier that the British can trace their ancestry back to the ice sheets? I wasn't just being hyperbolic. Jews believe that their covenantal claim to the land of Israel stretches back about 3,000 years. Well, there's this blog post from Migration Watch UK summarising the work of Ed West in his 2013 book, The Diversity Illusion, lays out. It turns out that British DNA dates back to the first Paleolithic and Mesolithic settlers who crossed the English Channel 10,000 years ago, according to just, crackpot called Brian Sykes, the professor of human genetics at Oxford and author of Blood of the Isles. So again, this isn't just a far-right conspiracy. This is established anthropology, backed up by evidence. Most British DNA was probably in place before the arrival of the first Indo-European speaking farmers from the Middle East around 4000 BC. In the words of Stephen Oppenheimer, the author of Origins of the British, the ultimate numerical impact of the Near Eastern Neolithic invasion of Europe was generally underwhelming, affecting no more than a third of European gene lines, and usually rather less. In Northwest Europe, that figure falls to 5% of the indigenous material DNA lines. So that means that, according to Oppenheimer, the English are only about 5.5% Anglo-Saxon anyway, although this varies by region, with Norfolk being the most at about 15%. So that means that we are still indigenous, Celtic and Brittonic, despite seeing the Romans and the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, and then the spattering of Jews and French Huguenots in the few hundred years before the 1948 British Nationality Act, Empire Windrush, the invasion of Indians and Pakistanis from the subcontinent, and then Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, and now Andy Burnham's migratory waves, which have been conducted without the consent of the British people. They have expressed they do not want it at every election, and still are told they must make concessions to their identity, redefining their sense of self to encompass its antonyms and unwanted arrivals anyway. The Vikings, who invaded in waves between the 8th and 11th centuries, comprise a very similar proportion of English DNA, about 5% at most, and the English of 1927 were more than 90% the descendants of the English of 927. So, if you were in 1927, you could trace your descendants back 1,000 years to when King Athelstan, the first king of all of England, vanquished the last Viking settlement. And that was about 50 or so years after the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. So I would say that that genetic continuity and that continuity of religious faith in a defined territory that's literally an island would qualify the criteria of land, ancestry, and religion that Melanie Phillips says constitutes Jewish identity but not British identity. Wouldn't you, Melanie? Speaking of Jews, the Jews of Rowan never totaled more than 5,000 or 6,000 before they were expelled by Edward I. They were, of course, brought over by William the Conqueror during the Norman conquests because, I believe, according to a report I read in Civitas, it was actually, he managed to finance it by borrowing from European Jews. And the Jewish return occurred under Charles II, as allowed by Oliver Cromwell, in the 1660s. So, yeah, they've been here for a few hundred years, thanks for fish and chips, I suppose, but they've always been Jews. They've been a separate tribe, living without relative trouble, mainly in the East End for quite a while, until the Second World War, when suddenly we had to redefine our entire legal architecture, because, of course, Jews were persecuted in the Holocaust, to have a profound suspicion of ourselves turning into the Nazis, even though we fought the Nazis, and then we had to treat every single population around the world as if they were the Jews fleeing the Holocaust, which just doesn't make any sense. In 1939, before the Second World War, there were only 20 to 30,000 non-whites in the UK. That's 0.04% of the population, and that's about 5,000 Africans and West Indians. All of this migration occurred before the British Nationality Act, which decided to open the floodgates to our former colonies in the Commonwealth. But at the end of the Second World War, over 70% of British DNA dated back more than 6,000 years on these islands, and between them the Celts, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and Normans made less of a genetic impact than post-war migration has. This has been rapid, unwanted demographic sabotage, so why should we redefine our historic identity and forfeit our claim to our land just to accommodate it? Do you know who didn't think so? Melanie Phillips in 2009. She wrote in the Daily Mail after Andrew Never, the former speechwriter for Barbara Roche, Home Office minister who said Britain is a nation of immigrants, which was what that Migration Watch blog was responding to. Andrew Never said that the express policy of the Blair government was to rub the right's nose in diversity and render its arguments out of date by opening the borders and lying about the quantity of immigrants that were going to come into the country. Melanie Phillips wrote, "The Labour government has engaged upon a deliberate and secret policy of national and cultural sabotage. This astonishing revelation surfaced quite casually last weekend in a newspaper article by Andrew Never, speechwriter for Tony Blair, Jack Straw, David Blunkett and Barbara Roche, who wrote the landmark speech in September 2000 that called for a loosening of immigration controls. In 1997, in its election manifesto, Labour promised firm control over immigration, and in 2005 it promised to crack down on abuse. Its 2001 manifesto merely said that immigration rules needed to reflect changes to the economy to meet skills shortages, so they lied time and time again. Nobody voted for mass migration, especially not third world migration. But as Phillips writes, all this concealed a monumental shift of policy, for Never wrote that until February last year, when a new points-based system was introduced to limit foreign workers in response to increasing uproar, the purpose of the policy Roche ushered in was to open up the UK to mass immigration. Some 2.3 million migrants had been added to the population since 2001. It's been 6 million in 6 years under the Boris wave. Since 1997, the number of work permits has quadrupled to 120,000 a year. There has been more immigration since 1997 and now than between 1066 and the Second World War. And that's not just because of technological change, that's because of deliberate policy change and ideology. And that same ideology seeks to deny that the British people are distinct ethnic groups with a claim to their country in order to deprive them of a means of opposing that rapid demographic change. So we shouldn't be perpetuating it. The departure from our settled identity based on our homogeneous demographics, our dislike of cousin marriage, our established Christian faith, and our self-confidence shouldn't be departed from just because a treacherous government inflicting waves and waves of millions of foreigners upon us have induced some confusion about it. Unless policies change, Phillips wrote, over the next 25 years, some 7 million more will be added to Britain's population. It's been way more than that. A rate of growth 3 times faster than took place in the 80s. Such an increase is simply unsustainable. I agree. So why should we seek to accommodate them, just because they have a bit of paper that you say is sacred? And as she says, the driving purpose, according to Nether, was to make the UK truly multicultural. Okay, well, if you change the demographics, then the culture changes. So why should we expect, and why should Melanie Phillips expect, for the demographics to change, but the culture to remain the same just because you've given them British passports? We have the Home Office this week giving out anti-rape pamphlets to asylum seekers. They know they're different from us. They know that they behave differently. They have completely different cultural expectations. We don't have a theory of mind for them. We don't understand them. They aren't as intelligent as us. We do not live like them. They cannot live like us. They shouldn't be here, and just declaring them British doesn't change that. Just as I can't call myself Jewish on a whim and live in Israel, they can't be called British either. And in this article, Melanie Phillips complains about the rise of the BNP and Nick Griffin. She said that a YouGov poll taken after Question Time, when Nick Griffin appeared, showed that 22% of British voters would seriously consider voting for them, and that's because immigration was a salient issue. And do you think that's gone away just because they've had their passports rubber stamped? Just because the government said, well, we've given them a magic bit of paper, they touched the soil, so they're stuck here forever. No, people realise these people don't need to be here. It's all optional. If it was done by government policy, it can be undone by government policy. And so I think Melanie Phillips, today, should be listening to Melanie Phillips in 2009, because Melanie Phillips just written a piece saying that Restore's ideology is the antithesis of Britishness. No, ideology is the antithesis of British identity. And you have an ideology, Melanie, which says that anyone from anywhere can declare themselves British, which is fundamentally liberal. It has the anthropology of the blank slate. But that anthropology doesn't apply to Jewish people for some reason. And I'm sorry, but that's not an exception that I'm going to stand by. It's not a double standard that I'm keen to sustain, because I have children on the way, and even if they respect their double standard, the peers that outnumber them from the third world are not going to. They're going to mistreat them. And if it was an undesirable fate for Jews to be an expelled and mistreated and hated minority in Europe until they had their own nation in Israel, then I would like to avert that fate for my children too. But why does Melanie deny that standard? Well, as Ed West wrote in The Diversity Illusion on page 49, such radical change, immigration, demographics, and the redefining of British identity, could not have been accepted if it were not for the intellectual justification provided by the idea of universalism, that races and ethnic groups are just meaningless social constructs, nations, artificial creations, and therefore states cannot be drawn along any ethnic lines. As Mario Vargas Llosa wrote in The Culture of Liberty, quote, "The notion of collective identity is an ideological fiction and the foundation of nationalism." Nationalism has become a dirty word after the Second World War, but I don't accept that. I accept Ernest Gellner's definition of nationalism, himself not a nationalist, saying that nationalism is the principle of ethnic groups, peoples, having self-determination in a state, a territory, and a political system that they feel represents them. And nationalism is a sentiment that is the correct way to organize nations, peoples, and that sentiment is provoked when it is violated. Nationalism rises in direct proportion to the nation-state being confiscated from the nation, or the nation's own demographic security, or their power and status in their own nation-state is under threat. And Melanie Phillips is wrong to fear this. A self-confident European or British people does not morph into Adolf Hitler overnight, because that is the foundational fear that she has. It's essentially, if white people or English people, British people start defining themselves along ethnic lines, then there's going to be a difference between them and other ethnic groups, including Jews, and they're going to expel them or exterminate them, and we're going to get Hitler all over again. It's just not true. It's just not the case. I mean, Jews lived in relative peace and security when British people were the majority of their country, when they possessed their country, for about 300 to 400 years. And Yoram Hazony recognises this, and he has this principle of reciprocal nationalism in his book, Virtue of Nationalism. And Melanie Phillips spoke to Yoram when I spoke to her in Jerusalem, and she knows that he disagrees with her, and he actually agrees with what he would call ethno-nationalism in Israel for everyone else. I don't even use that term, but Yoram does. And Melanie agrees with Yoram that Israel should be a nation-state for Jews, but she just doesn't agree that it should be a nation-state. But she just doesn't agree that Britain should enjoy the same standard of nation-state for themselves as Jews enjoy in Israel, as Melanie does in Israel. Yoram writes in The Virtue of Nationalism on pages 107 to 108, "The millions of Jews living dispersed among these great nations, Britain and America, in the 20th century, enjoyed generous personal freedoms, yet as their fellow Jews were slaughtered in the Holocaust, with none to save them, they understood, as we too must understand, that all the courses of action that they truly desired were in fact available to them. Despite the formal individual liberties that had been granted to them, they did not have national freedom, and so they were not free. National freedom came only with the establishment of a Jewish national state in Israel, which Yoram's grandfather lived to see." And so Yoram, an opponent of the post-war consensus, creates a dichotomy of the two responses to Auschwitz. Either the European Union, a self-hating empire that sought to erase European identity and, by importing the Third World, inadvertently give rise to anti-Semitism, as the likes of Renaud Camus warned, or Israel, a model of nation-states for nations, peoples, so they can live self-confidently in countries that reflect their interests, ensure their demographic security, and allow them to defend themselves against genocidal imperialism from people that hate them. He writes, "For most Jews, Auschwitz has a very particular meaning. It was not Theodor Herzl's Zionist organization that persuaded nearly all Jews the world over that there could be no other way but to establish an independent Jewish state in our day. It was Auschwitz and the deaths of 6 million Jews at the hands of the Germans and their sympathizers that accomplished this. From the horror and humiliation of Auschwitz, this one inescapable lesson emerged, that it was Jewish dependence on the military protection of others that had brought this about. Today, most Jews continue to believe that the only thing that has really changed since those millions of our people perished, the only thing that stands as a bulwark against the repetition of this chapter in the world's history, is Israel. Now, I think that's incorrect, because I don't think they need to mistrust host populations to that degree, but it is true that, well, there's very unlikely to be a Holocaust in Israel. The ultimate guarantor of the continued existence of Jewish people is the state of Israel. And so I want that for my people too. And Yoram supports that. He says, Jews, however, are not the only ones for whom Auschwitz has become an important political symbol. Many Europeans too see Auschwitz as being at the heart of the lesson of the Second World War, but the conclusions they draw are precisely the opposite of those drawn by Jews. Following Immanuel Kant, they see Auschwitz as the ultimate expression of that barbarism, that brutal debasement of humanity, which is national particularism. From this point of view, the death camps provide the ultimate proof of the evil of permitting nations to decide for themselves how to dispose of the military power in their possession. The obvious conclusion is that it was wrong to give the German nation this power of life and death. If such evil is to be prevented from happening again and again, the answer must be in the dismantling of Germany and the other national states of Europe, and the yoking together of all the European peoples under a single international government. Eliminate the national state once and for all, and you have sealed off that dark road to Auschwitz. Notice that, according to this view, it is not Israel that is the answer to Auschwitz, but the European Union. A united Europe will make it impossible for Germany or any other European nation to rise up and persecute others once again. In this sense, it is the European Union that stands as the guarantor of the future peace of the Jews and indeed of all humanity. Here, then, are two competing paradigms concerning the meaning of Auschwitz. Each is looking at the same facts. Both paradigms take it as a given that millions were murdered at Auschwitz by the Germans and their collaborators, that the deeds done there were utterly evil, and Jews and others who died there were helpless victims of this evil. But at this point, agreement ends. Individuals looking at the same facts by way of these different paradigms see different things. Paradigm A: Auschwitz represents the unspeakable horror of Jewish women and men standing empty-handed and naked watching their children die for want of a rifle with which to protect them. Or Paradigm B: Auschwitz represents the unspeakable horror of German soldiers using force against others, backed by nothing but their own government's views as to their national rights and interests. It is important to recognize that these two views, which at first do not seem to be talking about the same thing, are actually describing moral positions that are almost perfectly irreconcilable. In the one, it is the agency of the murderers that is seen as the source of the evil. In the other, it is the powerlessness of the victims, a seemingly subtle difference in perspective that opens up into a chasm when we turn these competing paradigms into another direction and look at Israel through their eyes. Here are the same two paradigms, with their attention turned to the independent state of Israel. Paradigm A: Israel represents Jewish women and men standing rifle in hand, watching over their own children, and all other Jewish children, protecting them. Israel is the opposite of Auschwitz. Paradigm B: Israel represents the unspeakable horror of Jewish soldiers using force against others, backed by nothing but their own government's views as to their national rights and interests. Israel is Auschwitz. Which is why this Israel for me but not for thee mentality leads to Western progressives saying Israel is a white settler colonialist project and it must be destroyed. This is what Drew Pavlo was trying to point out to Melanie Phillips on Twitter, and she was saying nonsense. As an ex-leftist herself, there are plenty of left-wing arguments for the existence of Israel. Interesting. Why aren't they making any, Melanie? Why are the wolves at your door? Why are the Democratic Socialists of America taking over the Democrat Party? Why are the rabid Greens pushing the Labour Party, not just to appease Muslims, but to criticise Israel, recognise Palestine? Why are all of your progressives, which should in theory be aligned with you, abandoning you? And why is it the nationalists who are saying to you, look, I understand Israel's plight, but I would like it for myself, the ones that you are insulting and rebuking? You are standing on a patch of ground around which the tide is rising, and you are rejecting the lifeboat, the yacht, the helicopter being sent to you as a sign that this is the way out. I agree with Yoram Hazony. If statelessness, persecution, and genocide is undesirable for Jewish people, then it's undesirable for our people too. And if we can avert that horrible fate, we should. And if an Israel for Jews is the way to prevent the Holocaust happening in the future, then a Britain for the British people, the English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish, and the ability to determine what that identity means, to police its boundaries, to exclude people they don't want here from consideration as a member of our tribe, and to possess that country without question and retaining our demographic security, is the way to stop the same fate befalling us in our country too. If Israel is a homeland for the Jewish people, then Britain must be a homeland for the British people. And I'm not going to accept a double standard that says, you get to have that, but I don't.